Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Foundation Cracks. Calvin Charles had built his life on 3 pillars: discipline, loyalty, and the unforgiving North Sea. At 42, his weathered hands told the story of 15 years on oil rigs, each scar a testament to survival in one of the world's most dangerous professions. The money was exceptional, the isolation necessary, and the work kept his mind from dwelling on the wreckage of his marriage. 3 years ago, Melody Price had shattered their 12-year marriage with a betrayal so complete it left Calvin questioning everything he believed about trust. She'd been sleeping with Rick Haas, a smooth-talking construction foreman with a record of domestic violence that Calvin discovered too late. The divorce was swift and brutal. Melody took half of everything Calvin had earned bleeding on the rigs, plus custody of their 15-year-old son, Matthew Baker Charles. Calvin had tried to maintain a relationship with Matthew, but Melody poisoned every interaction. She moved Rick into Calvin's former home within weeks of the divorce, parading her new relationship like a victory flag. Calvin channeled his rage into work, taking the most dangerous, highest-paying contracts in the North Sea. The isolation suited him. It kept him from doing something he might regret. Rick Haas was everything Calvin despised, a man who used his fists to solve problems and his charm to manipulate women. At 38, Rick had bounced between construction jobs, leaving a trail of broken relationships and police reports. He had a particular talent for intimidating teenagers, having terrorized his previous girlfriend's children until they feared coming home. When Rick moved in with Melody, he immediately began asserting dominance over Matthew. The boy, tall for his age but still lanky and awkward, became Rick's favorite target for psychological warfare. Rick demanded respect he hadn't earned, compliance he didn't deserve, and submission that went against everything Calvin had taught his son. The call came on a Tuesday evening, North Sea time. Calvin was in his bunk after a 16-hour shift when his satellite phone buzzed. Matthew's voice, choked with pain and terror, cut through the static like a blade. Dad, I need you to come home. Rick, he broke my leg. He said, this is what happens when my weakling father is out of town. Dad, I told him I'd never call him Dad, and he just snapped. Calvin's blood turned to ice. The phone trembled in his grip as Matthew continued, his voice breaking with each word. Mom was there, Dad. She just watched. She said I provoked him by being disrespectful. Dad, I can't stay here anymore. The line went dead. Calvin sat in the darkness of his bunk, the phone still pressed to his ear. Around him, the rig groaned and swayed with the North Sea swells, but he felt perfectly still, the kind of stillness that comes before an earthquake. For 3 years, he'd controlled his rage, channeled it into work, convinced himself that distance was the answer. That was over now. Calvin reached in his gear bag and pulled out a small black notebook, addresses and phone numbers he'd collected over the years. Men he'd worked with who'd found themselves in impossible situations. Men who solved problems that couldn't be solved through legal channels. Men who understood that sometimes justice required getting your hands dirty. His finger stopped on one number, Angelo Murray, a former Special Forces operator who now provided security consulting for oil companies. Angelo had mentioned once, during a late-night conversation on a rig off Aberdeen, that he maintained connections with people who specialized in permanent solutions to permanent problems. Calvin had never thought he'd use that number. He thought about it now. Chapter 2. The Reckoning Begins. Calvin walked off the drill floor at 0300 hours, his supervisor shouting questions that fell on deaf ears. The North Sea wind whipped across the platform as Calvin pulled out his satellite phone and dialed Rick's number, a number he'd memorized but never called. Rick answered on the 3rd ring, his voice thick with sleep and alcohol. Who the hell is this? This is Calvin Charles. I believe you know my son. A pause. Then Rick's voice, gaining confidence with cruelty. Your boy learned some manners tonight. Maybe if you'd been around to teach him respect instead of hiding on your oil rig, this wouldn't have happened. Calvin's grip tightened on the phone. I'm going to say this once, Rick. Stay away from my son. Rick laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Or what? You're in the middle of the ocean, Calvin. Your boy is here with us, and he's learning what a real man looks like. Maybe next time he'll think twice before running his mouth. Rick, Calvin said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. I want you to listen very carefully. I'm not just coming home. I'm bringing help. The kind of help that makes problems disappear forever. If you're smart, and I suspect you're not, you'll take Matthew to the hospital and then you'll leave town. You threatening me, Rig Pig? Rick's voice was full of bravado, but Calvin caught the slight tremor underneath. No, Rick, I'm making you a promise. Calvin ended the call and immediately dialed Angelo Murray. Angelo picked up on the first ring, as if he'd been expecting the call. Calvin, what's the situation? My boy, my ex-wife's boyfriend broke his leg because he wouldn't call him dad. I need immediate extraction from the rig, and I need the kind of backup that ensures this never happens again. Copy that. I can have a helicopter to your position in 6 hours. As for backup, Angelo paused. How permanent are we talking? Calvin looked out at the dark North Sea, thinking of Matthew's broken voice, Melody's betrayal, Rick's laughter. Permanent enough that they understand actions have consequences. Roger. I'll bring Dave McGuire, former Delta, good with close protection and problem resolution. We'll handle the details en route. Angelo, Calvin said, this isn't just about my son anymore. This is about sending a message to everyone who thinks they can take advantage of my family situation. Understood. See you in 6 hours. Calvin spent those 6 hours planning. He'd built a fortune in oil work, money that Melody didn't know about, stored in offshore accounts and shell companies. Money that could buy silence, cooperation, and solutions to complex problems. But this wasn't about money. This was about respect, fear, and the kind of justice that courtrooms couldn't deliver. When the helicopter touched down on the rig's helipad, Calvin was ready. He carried one bag, clothes, documents, and a substantial amount of cash. Angelo Murray stepped out first, a compact man with the kind of eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. Behind him came Dave McGuire, tall and silent, with the fluid movements of a predator. Calvin, Angelo said, extending his hand. Dave, meet Calvin Charles. Calvin, Dave specializes in psychological operations and conflict resolution. Dave's handshake was firm, his gaze measuring. Angelo briefed me on the flight. We're going to make this right. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying them toward shore, Calvin felt a calm settle over him that he hadn't experienced in years. For too long, he'd been reactive, letting others dictate the terms of his life. Melody had taken his home, his money, his son. Rick had terrorized Matthew and threatened Calvin's authority. That ended now. What's the plan? Dave asked over the helicopter's rotor noise. Calvin smiled, a cold expression that made both operators exchange glances. First, we collect my son and get him medical attention. Then we teach Rick Haas and my ex-wife about consequences. But not the way they'll expect. Meaning we don't just hurt them. We destroy everything they've built, everyone they care about, and every sense of security they've ever had. When we're done, they'll spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, knowing that crossing Calvin Charles was the worst mistake they ever made. Angelo nodded approvingly. I like it. Comprehensive. One more thing, Calvin said, his voice carrying over the engine noise. This isn't temporary. This isn't something they recover from. I want them to understand that some actions create enemies for life. Chapter 3. Pieces in Motion. The helicopter touched down at a private airfield outside Aberdeen at dawn. Calvin's first stop was a secure storage facility where he maintained equipment for situations like this. Situations he'd hoped would never arise. Inside Unit 47, wrapped in waterproof cases, were items that most civilians never knew existed. Surveillance equipment, untraceable communication devices, and documentation that could create or destroy identities. Impressive setup, Dave observed, watching Calvin methodically check each piece of equipment. You've been planning for something like this. In my line of work, you learn that violence is always a possibility, Calvin replied, loading a case of micro cameras into a duffel bag. The smart play is to be prepared for it. Angelo studied a tablet displaying real-time surveillance footage of Calvin's old house. the one where Melody now lived with Rick and Matthew. Your boy's still inside. Hospital records show Rick took him to the ER around midnight, claimed it was a soccer injury. Kid got a cast and crutches. Calvin's jaw tightened. Soccer injury. The interesting part, Angelo continued, is that Rick's been making calls all morning. Seems your conversation spooked him more than he let on. He's reaching out to some interesting contacts. Dave looked up from the weapons case he was inventorying. What kind of contacts? Rick's got connections to the Pitts family. Bradley Pitts runs a small-time operation out of the construction unions. Mostly loan sharking and intimidation, but they've got a reputation for escalation. Calvin processed this information with a methodical precision that had kept him alive on dozens of oil rigs. He's calling in backup. That's what it looks like, Angelo confirmed. Bradley Pitts has two brothers, Alan and Vince. They handle the family's enforcement activities. Good, Calvin said, surprising both operators. I was wondering how to draw them all out at once. The drive to Calvin's old neighborhood took 40 minutes. Calvin sat in the passenger seat of Angelo's Range Rover, watching familiar landmarks pass by. The school where Matthew played baseball, the park where Calvin had taught him to ride a bike, the restaurant where he'd proposed to Melody 15 years ago. All of it felt like archaeological evidence of a life he'd once lived. Target acquired, Dave said from the back seat, watching the house through high-powered binoculars. Your ex-wife just left in a blue Honda. Kid's visible in the front window. He's on the couch with his leg elevated. Calvin's heart clenched at the sight of his son. Even from a distance, Matthew looked smaller, more fragile than Calvin remembered. The cast extended from his ankle to his knee. Rick's still inside, Angelo noted. He's pacing, making phone calls. Body language suggests agitation. He should be agitated, Calvin said. Where's the surveillance van? Angelo checked his watch. Hugh Abbott should be in position now. Hugh Abbott was Angelo's technology specialist, a former NSA analyst who'd left government service after becoming disillusioned with bureaucratic limitations. He now provided technical support for private operations, specializing in electronic surveillance and digital manipulation. Calvin's phone buzzed with a text from Hugh. Audio video established. Recording everything. Rick's next call is to Bradley Pitts. Meeting set for 6 p.m. at Zamora Construction Yard. Perfect, Calvin said. That gives us 8 hours to prepare the welcome party. Angelo turned to face Calvin. What exactly are you planning? Calvin's expression was calm, but his eyes held a coldness that made even the experienced operators uncomfortable. Rick thinks he's calling in reinforcements. What he's actually doing is gathering all my targets in one location. And then we remind them that some people shouldn't be threatened. Dave leaned forward. Calvin, I need to ask, how far are you willing to take this? Calvin was quiet for a long moment, watching his son through the window. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Dave, 3 years ago, I discovered that my wife had been cheating on me with a man who beats children. I gave her half of everything I'd earned and walked away because I believe in doing the right thing. Last night, that same man broke my son's leg for refusing to call him dad, and my ex-wife watched it happen. He turned to face both men. I'm taking this as far as it needs to go, all the way to the end. Angelo nodded slowly. Understood, but we do this smart. No collateral damage, no evidence, no complications. Agreed, Calvin said. But when we're done, Rick Haas and the Pitts family are going to wish they'd never heard my name. The Range Rover pulled away from the curb, leaving the house behind. Calvin didn't look back. The next time he saw his son, it would be as a father who'd proven that some lines should never be crossed. The war was about to begin. Chapter 4. The Trap Springs. Zamora Construction Yard sat on the industrial outskirts of town, a sprawling complex of warehouses, equipment storage, and administrative buildings surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with razor wire. It was the perfect location for a meeting that required privacy, and the perfect killing ground for an ambush. Calvin studied the layout from Hugh Abbott's surveillance van, parked 3 blocks away behind a defunct gas station. Through multiple camera feeds, he watched Rick Haas pace nervously near the main warehouse while the Pitts brothers arrived in a black pickup truck. Bradley Pitts stepped out first, A thick-set man in his 40s with the scarred knuckles of someone who'd spent decades settling disputes with violence. His brothers Alan and Vince flanked him, both carrying the easy confidence of men who'd never met a problem they couldn't intimidate into submission. "Audio's clear," Hugh reported, adjusting his equipment. "They're discussing how to handle the oil rig cowboy." Calvin listened through noise-canceling headphones as Rick detailed his conversation with Calvin, his voice gaining bravado as he described the perceived threat. "Guy thinks he can scare me from the middle of the ocean," Rick said. "Time to show him what happens when you threaten the wrong people." Bradley Pitts laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the warehouse walls. "Rick, you call the right crew. We've been handling tough guys for 20 years. Your oil worker's about to learn that threats don't mean much when you're outnumbered." "What's the plan?" Vince asked, lighting a cigarette. "Simple," Bradley replied. "We pay a visit to his boy, make sure Daddy understands that his threats have consequences. Maybe break the other leg." Calvin removed his headphones and turned to Angelo, who was monitoring police frequencies on a separate radio. "Any heat?" "Nothing. Police are focused on a domestic disturbance across town. We've got clear operational space." Dave McGuire finished checking his equipment, a combination of tactical gear and specialized electronics that would leave no traces. Thermal imaging shows 4 targets in the main warehouse. No additional personnel in the surrounding buildings. Calvin opened his gear bag and withdrew items that looked innocuous but served deadly purposes. A small aerosol canister labeled industrial cleaner contained a fast-acting paralytic agent. Zip ties that appeared standard but were designed to tighten automatically when struggle was detected. And a device that looked like a simple phone charger but could override electronic locks and disable security systems. "Remember," Calvin said, "this isn't about killing them quickly. It's about making sure they understand the consequences of their choices." The 3 men approached the warehouse complex from different angles, communicating through encrypted earpieces. Calvin entered through a maintenance door that Hugh had unlocked remotely, while Angelo and Dave took positions at alternate exits to prevent escape. Calvin moved through the warehouse shadows with the patient precision of a predator. 15 years on oil rigs had taught him to work in dangerous conditions without making mistakes, a skill set that translated surprisingly well to stalking human prey. He reached the main warehouse floor and positioned himself behind a stack of construction equipment, 30 feet from where Rick and the Pitts brothers continued their planning session. "How do we know this guy's even coming back to town?" Alan Pitts asked. "He said he was bringing help," Rick replied. "The kind that makes people disappear. Probably means some mercenary buddies from his oil rig days." "Let them come," Bradley said. "We'll be ready." Calvin smiled in the darkness. They were so focused on preparing for a threat they expected, they'd completely missed the one that was already among them. He activated the aerosol device and released its contents into the warehouse's ventilation system. The paralytic agent was odorless, colorless, and would take effect gradually, first causing disorientation, then muscle weakness, finally complete temporary paralysis. Within minutes, Rick began rubbing his eyes. "Something's wrong with the air in here. Feels heavy." Bradley Pitts tried to stand and stumbled slightly. "Yeah, I'm feeling it too. Maybe there's a gas leak." But it was too late. One by one, they collapsed. First Alan, then Vince, then Rick, and finally Bradley. Not unconscious, but completely unable to move, their minds fully aware while their bodies betrayed them. Calvin stepped out of the shadows, activating a portable floodlight that illuminated the 4 men lying helplessly on the warehouse floor. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice echoing in the vast space, "thank you for gathering in one convenient location." Rick's eyes widened with terror as recognition hit him. Calvin knelt beside him, checking that the paralytic had taken full effect. "You're probably wondering what comes next," Calvin continued, pulling on latex gloves. "The good news is that the paralytic agent is temporary. You'll regain full mobility in about 6 hours. The bad news is what happens during those 6 hours." Calvin walked to each man in turn, securing them with the specialized zip ties and checking their identification. Bradley Pitts carried a wallet filled with fake IDs and credit cards, confirming Calvin's suspicion that the family's criminal activities went deeper than simple intimidation. "Here's what's going to happen," Calvin said, sitting on a crate so he could address all 4 men simultaneously. "You're going to lie here for the next few hours and think about your life choices. Specifically, you're going to think about what happens to people who hurt children." He pulled out his phone and began taking photographs, faces, identification, license plates from the parking lot. "These images are going to digital dead drops around the world. If anything happens to me, they'll be distributed to every law enforcement agency, rival criminal organization, and interested party in your operational area." Calvin stood and walked to a tool bench, returning with a heavy wrench. But that's just insurance. The real lesson starts now. What happened next took exactly 47 minutes. Calvin worked with the methodical precision of a master craftsman, ensuring that each man understood precisely why they were being punished and what would happen if they ever threatened his family again. When he was finished, all 4 men were still alive, still conscious, but fundamentally changed. They would carry the physical and psychological scars of this encounter for the rest of their lives. Constant reminders that Calvin Charles was not a man who forgave or forgot. Calvin collected his equipment and walked toward the warehouse exit. Behind him, for men who'd terrorized others for decades now understood what true terror felt like. "Gentlemen," Calvin called over his shoulder, "if you ever see my son, my ex-wife, or me again, I suggest you remember this conversation." The warehouse door closed behind him with a final, echoing bang. Chapter 5. Unraveling Threads. Calvin sat in his rental car outside Matthew's school, watching his son navigate the hallways on crutches. It had been 48 hours since the warehouse, and the psychological effects were already rippling through Rick and Melody's world like cracks in a dam. His phone buzzed with a text from Hugh Abbott. "Rick hasn't left the house since yesterday." Multiple calls to hospitals, police, lawyers. Melody's making arrangements to visit her sister in Portland. Calvin smiled grimly. They were running scared, exactly as planned. But running wasn't enough, not for what they'd done to Matthew. Angelo appeared in the passenger seat, moving with the silent efficiency that made him perfect for this kind of work. Update from the Pitts family. Bradley's in hiding. Brothers are talking to anyone who'll listen about leaving town permanently. Word is they've told their associates that Calvin Charles is off limits forever. "Good," Calvin said. "But there's still the matter of Melody and Rick. They think geography will save them." "It won't." Calvin's expression darkened. "Geography is just another puzzle to solve. What matters is making sure they understand that betraying family has permanent consequences." Through the school's windows, Calvin watched Matthew struggle to open his locker while balancing on crutches. Other students gave him space, but Calvin could see the shame in his son's posture, the humiliation of being broken by a man he'd refused to call dad. "I want to see him," Calvin said quietly. "Not advisable," Angelo replied. "Rick and Melody probably have lawyers watching for parental kidnapping charges. Better to wait until this is finished." Calvin knew Angelo was right, but the distance from his son felt like a physical wound. 3 years of forced separation, 3 years of watching Rick Haas poison a relationship between father and son, 3 years of legal threats and custody restrictions. All of that ended now. "Tell me about Melody's sister," Calvin said. Angelo consulted his tablet. "Lindsay Jefferson lives in Portland with her husband, Jesus Lyons. They run a small restaurant called Jefferson's Kitchen. No children, no criminal connections, probably don't even know the real reason for Melody's visit. Perfect cover for someone trying to disappear," Calvin mused. "Melody thinks she can hide behind family, claims she's protecting Matthew from the dangerous ex-husband. The legal angle? She's building a case for emergency custody modification. Rick's telling everyone that Calvin threatened him with violence, that he's unpredictable and dangerous. They'll claim Matthew needs protection." Calvin processed this information with the same methodical approach he used for complex oil rig operations. Every system had weak points, every plan had vulnerabilities. The key was finding the pressure points and applying force precisely where it would do the most damage. "You," Calvin said into his phone. "I need comprehensive surveillance on Melody and Rick. Phone calls, emails, financial transactions, travel arrangements. Everything. Already in progress, he replied. Melody's been researching domestic violence shelters and emergency protection orders. Rick's been calling lawyers about restraining orders and criminal threats charges. Time frame, they're planning to leave tomorrow morning. Rick's staying behind to handle the situation while Melody takes Matthew to Portland for his safety. Calvin felt the familiar calm that came before decisive action. Perfect. Angelo, I need transportation to Portland and full operational support. Done. Dave's already en route to establish surveillance on the Jefferson house. Calvin watched Matthew disappear into his classroom, then started the car. Phase 1 had been about establishing dominance over Rick and his criminal associates. Phase 2 was about ensuring that Melody understood the consequences of enabling child abuse. But Phase 3 was about making sure his son never had to live in fear again. Calvin's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but Angelo's equipment identified it immediately. Melody Price, calling from burner phone. Calvin answered. Hello, Melody. Calvin. Her voice was tight with fear and anger. I don't know what you did to Rick, but he's terrified. He won't tell me what happened, but he keeps talking about leaving town. Maybe Rick finally met someone who doesn't tolerate men who break children's bones. Calvin, you can't just threaten people and expect. Melody, Calvin interrupted, his voice dropping to the same quiet tone that had terrified Rick. I want you to listen very carefully. Rick broke our son's leg because Matthew refused to call him dad. You watched it happen and called it a soccer injury. Silence on the line. I'm not threatening anyone, Melody. I'm correcting a problem. Rick learned that some actions have consequences. Now it's your turn to learn the same lesson. What do you want? Her voice was barely a whisper. I want you to understand that enabling someone who hurts Matthew makes you just as guilty as Rick. I want you to understand that running to Portland won't protect you from the choices you've made. Calvin could hear her breathing accelerate. How do you know about Portland? I know everything, Melody. I know about Lindsay's restaurant, about Jesus's motorcycle, about the guest room where you think you'll be safe. I know about the lawyers you've called and the stories you're planning to tell. Calvin, please. You made a choice when you watched Rick break our son's leg and did nothing. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. Calvin ended the call and pulled out of the school parking lot. In his rearview mirror, he could see the building where his son sat in class, probably wondering if his father would ever come home. Calvin would come home. But first, he had promises to keep. Chapter 6, The Reckoning's Edge. Portland's Jefferson district bustled with afternoon traffic as Calvin sat in a coffee shop across from Jefferson's kitchen, watching Melody help their son out of a rented Toyota Camry. Matthew moved carefully on his crutches, still favoring his injured leg, while Melody carried their luggage with the nervous efficiency of someone convinced they were being pursued. They were right to be nervous. Calvin sipped his coffee and observed his targets through the restaurant's windows. Lindsay Jefferson embraced her sister warmly, while Jesus Lyons helped Matthew to a chair with genuine concern. These were good people who had no idea they were now harboring someone who'd enable child abuse. Calvin's phone buzzed with a message from Dave McGuire. Perimeter secured. No sign of Rick or law enforcement. Melody's been making calls to family attorneys in Portland. Calvin typed back. Letter. She's building her own trap. Through his earpiece, Hugh Abbott provided real-time intelligence. Melody just called her lawyer in Houston. Quote, Calvin's completely lost it. He threatened Rick so badly that Rick won't even leave the house. I think he might try to take Matthew by force. End quote. Calvin smiled coldly. Melody was constructing a narrative where she was the protective mother and Calvin was the dangerous ex-husband. It was a compelling story that would play well in family court, if she lived long enough to tell it. But Calvin had learned something important during his years on oil rigs. The most dangerous situations were often the ones where people thought they were safe. Calvin left the coffee shop and walked 2 blocks to a hardware store, where he purchased items that appeared completely innocent but would serve specific purposes in the hours ahead. Cable ties, industrial adhesive, electrical components, and a small propane torch, tools that any contractor might need for a routine job. By the time he returned to the surveillance position, Melody had settled into Jefferson's kitchen like she belonged there. Through the windows, Calvin could see her helping with dinner service while Matthew sat at a corner table doing homework, his broken leg propped on a chair. Calvin's heart clenched at the sight of his son. Matthew looked older somehow, as if Rick's violence had stolen something fundamental from his childhood. The easy smile Calvin remembered was gone, replaced by the watchful wariness of someone who'd learned that safety was an illusion. That was going to change. At 11 p.m., Jefferson's kitchen closed for the night. Calvin watched the family retire to the apartment above the restaurant. Lindsay and Jesus to their bedroom, Melody and Matthew to the guest room that opened onto a fire escape. Calvin gave them an hour to fall asleep, then began his approach. The fire escape was old but well-maintained, with steps that barely creaked under Calvin's weight. Years of working on oil rigs had taught him to move silently in dangerous environments, a skill that served him well now. The guest room window was unlocked, a small-town oversight that would prove costly. Calvin slipped inside like a shadow, moving past Matthew's sleeping form to where Melody lay on a pull-out couch. She woke to find a gloved hand over her mouth and Calvin's face inches from hers in the darkness. "Don't make a sound," he whispered. "You'll wake Matthew, and I don't want him to see what comes next." Melody's eyes went wide with terror. Calvin zip-tied her hands behind her back and guided her toward the window. "We're going to have a conversation, Melody. Just you and me." Calvin led her down the fire escape to an alley behind the restaurant, where Angelo waited with a van. Within minutes, they were driving toward the industrial district, Melody secured in the back while Calvin sat beside her. "Calvin, please," she whispered. "Matthew needs his mother." "Matthew needed his mother 3 nights ago when Rick broke his leg," Calvin replied. "Where was his mother then?" Melody began to cry. Not the manipulative tears she'd used during their divorce, but the raw terror of someone who'd finally realized the magnitude of their mistake. The van stopped at an abandoned warehouse that Angelo had prepared earlier. Inside, a single chair sat under a harsh floodlight, surrounded by shadows that seemed to swallow sound. Calvin secured Melody to the chair and activated a video camera. "This is being recorded, Melody. Your confession will ensure that if anything happens to me, the truth about what you did to Matthew will become public knowledge." "I didn't do anything," she protested. "Rick was the one." "You watched," Calvin said, his voice cutting through her excuses like a blade. "You watched a grown man break a 15-year-old boy's leg, and then you helped cover it up by calling it a soccer injury." Calvin walked to a table where he'd arranged his tools, the innocent hardware store purchases that would serve much more specific purposes. "You have 2 choices, Melody. You can confess what really happened that night, help me get custody of Matthew, and disappear from our lives forever. Or," Calvin picked up the propane torch and ignited it, the blue flame casting dancing shadows on the warehouse walls. "Or you can maintain your lies, and I'll make sure you understand exactly what Matthew felt when Rick broke his bones." Melody stared at the flame, then at Calvin's face, and saw something that made her blood turn to ice. This wasn't the man she'd married 15 years ago. This wasn't even the bitter ex-husband she'd divorced 3 years ago. This was someone who'd been pushed past every limit, someone who decided that traditional rules no longer applied. "What do you want me to say?" she whispered. Calvin turned off the torch and sat across from her. "I want you to tell the truth about what Rick did to Matthew. I want you to admit that you enabled it. And I want you to sign custody papers that give me full parental rights. And if I do that," Calvin's smile was colder than winter wind, "then you get to keep breathing. You get to disappear somewhere far away and start a new life, knowing that if you ever contact Matthew or me again, this conversation will continue where we left off." Melody looked around the warehouse, at the video camera, at the tools on the table, at the man she'd thought she could manipulate and control. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll do whatever you want." Calvin reactivated the camera. "Then let's begin. Start with the night Rick broke Matthew's leg, and don't leave out any details." As Melody began her confession, Calvin felt a cold satisfaction settle over him. Justice was a concept that courts and lawyers debated endlessly, but sometimes it required more direct intervention. Sometimes it required a father who refused to accept that anyone could hurt his child without consequences. Chapter 7. The Final Accounting. Calvin returned to Jefferson's kitchen at dawn, climbing the fire escape as quietly as he'd left. Matthew was still sleeping, unaware that his mother had spent the night confessing to her complicity in his abuse. Calvin stood over his son's bed for a long moment, memorizing the peaceful expression that had been so rare in recent years. Everything he'd done in the past week had been for this moment, the moment when he could finally bring his son home. Calvin's phone buzzed with a text from Angelo. Melody's confession and custody documentation have been filed with family court and distributed to relevant law enforcement agencies. Legal team confirms emergency custody transfer is valid. Calvin gently shook Matthew awake. His son's eyes opened slowly, then widened with shock and confusion. "Dad, how are you? What are you doing here?" "I'm taking you home, son," Calvin said quietly. "Get dressed and pack your things. We're leaving." "But Mom said," Matthew began, then stopped. "Where is she?" Calvin sat on the edge of the bed. "Your mother had to go away for a while, Matthew. She's dealing with some legal problems related to what Rick did to you." "Legal problems?" "The police know that Rick broke your leg on purpose, and they know your mother helped cover it up. She's going to face consequences for that." Matthew processed this information with the sharp intelligence Calvin had always admired. "Is she going to jail?" "That depends on a lot of factors," Calvin said honestly. "But regardless of what happens to her, you're coming home with me. Permanently." Matthew struggled to sit up, his cast making movement awkward. "Dad, I need to tell you something. About that night, Rick didn't just break my leg because I wouldn't call him Dad. He said you were weak, that you abandoned us, that real men don't run away to oil rigs when things get tough." Calvin felt his jaw tighten. "What did you say to that?" "I told him that you were the strongest man I knew, that you worked on oil rigs because they were dangerous and someone had to do it. I told him that you didn't abandon us. Mom drove you away." Matthew's voice grew stronger. "That's when he grabbed my leg and twisted it until it snapped. He said that's what happens to boys who don't respect their new father." Calvin pulled his son into a careful embrace, mindful of the cast. "You defended me." "Of course I did. You're my dad." 15 minutes later, Calvin carried Matthew's bags while his son navigated the stairs on crutches. Lindsay and Jesus waited in the kitchen, their faces showing confusion and concern. "Calvin," Lindsay said, "Melody said you might try to take Matthew, but she had legal custody." Calvin handed her a folder containing court documents. "Emergency custody has been transferred to me based on new evidence regarding Matthew's injury. Melody's parental rights are currently under legal review." Jesus examined the paperwork with the careful attention of someone who understood legal documents. "This looks legitimate, but shouldn't we wait for Melody to—" "Melody won't be returning," Calvin said. "She's agreed to voluntary relinquishment of custody in exchange for avoiding criminal prosecution." It wasn't exactly true, but it was close enough. Melody's confession had indeed created criminal liability, and her agreement to disappear permanently was a form of voluntary relinquishment. Lindsay looked between Calvin and Matthew, clearly struggling with the situation. "Matthew, is this what you want?" Matthew didn't hesitate. "I want to go home with my dad." The drive from Portland to Houston took 18 hours, with overnight stops in Medford and Sacramento. Calvin used the time to reconnect with his son, learning about the past 3 years from Matthew's perspective. The picture that emerged made Calvin's blood boil with renewed anger. Rick's psychological abuse had been systematic and cruel. He'd undermined Matthew's confidence, isolated him from friends, and used physical intimidation to establish dominance. Melody had not only allowed it, she'd actively supported Rick's discipline as necessary for raising a respectful young man. "He used to tell me that you didn't really love me," Matthew said as they crossed into Texas. "He said if you loved me, you wouldn't have let Mom take me away. He said real fathers fight for their children." Calvin gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I did fight for you, Matthew. I fought in court for 2 years. But the system is designed to favor mothers, especially when they make accusations about fathers being unstable or dangerous." "Rick told Mom to say those things." "Rick coached her on exactly what to say to keep me away from you," Calvin confirmed. "Every supervised visit, every restricted phone call, every holiday I missed. That was Rick's plan to replace me as your father." Matthew was quiet for several miles. Finally, he said, "Dad, what happened to Rick?" Mom said he was too scared to leave the house. Calvin had been dreading this question. "Rick learned that threatening my family has consequences. He won't be bothering us anymore." "Did you hurt him?" Calvin chose his words carefully. "I made sure he understood that some lines should never be crossed. Sometimes that's the only language bullies understand." "Good," Matthew said with surprising vehemence. "I hope he remembers it every day for the rest of his life." Calvin glanced at his son and saw something that both worried and pleased him, a hard edge that hadn't been there before Rick's abuse. Matthew was learning that the world contained people who would hurt him if given the chance, and that sometimes violence was the only effective response to violence. It was a lesson Calvin had hoped his son would never need to learn. By the time they reached Houston, Calvin had made several important decisions. First, he was retiring from oil rig work permanently. He had enough money saved to support them both while he established a land-based career. Second, they were moving to a new house in a different school district, away from any reminders of Melody and Rick. Third, Matthew would receive counseling to help him process the trauma of Rick's abuse. And fourth, Calvin would ensure that neither Melody nor Rick ever had the opportunity to threaten his family again. That last decision would require one final conversation. Chapter 8: Blood and Consequences. 3 months later, Calvin sat in his new home office reviewing security footage from the property's perimeter cameras. The house he'd purchased was a fortress disguised as a suburban home. Reinforced doors, bulletproof windows, and surveillance systems that would make government agencies envious. After what had happened with Rick and Melody, Calvin refused to ever again be caught unprepared. Matthew was thriving in his new school, his broken leg fully healed and his confidence slowly returning. Counseling had helped him process Rick's abuse, and martial arts classes were teaching him to defend himself physically and psychologically. Calvin had learned from Angelo that the most effective way to prevent future victimization was to ensure Matthew never again projected vulnerability. Calvin's phone buzzed with a message from Hugh Abbott. Rick Haas departed Houston yesterday. Destination unknown, but financial records suggest permanent relocation. Also, interesting development regarding Melody Price. Calvin called Hugh immediately. "What kind of development?" "She violated the terms of your agreement," Hugh reported. "She contacted Matthew's school 2 weeks ago, claiming to be verifying enrollment information. Then yesterday, she called your neighbor asking about Matthew's well-being." Calvin felt the familiar coldness settle over him. "She's testing boundaries. That's my assessment. She's probably hoping enough time has passed that you'll tolerate some contact." "She's wrong," Calvin said. "Where is she now?" "Still in Portland, living with her sister. But she's been researching lawyers who specialize in overturning custody agreements." Calvin processed this information with growing anger. He'd given Melody a simple choice: disappear permanently or face the consequences of her actions. She'd chosen to disappear, but apparently lacked the intelligence to stay disappeared. "Hugh, I need you to send Melody a reminder about our agreement." "What kind of reminder?" Calvin's voice carried the same quiet menace that had terrified Rick and the Pitts brothers. "The kind that ensures she never forgets the consequences of contacting my son." 2 days later, Calvin flew to Portland. He told Matthew he was handling some business related to his retirement from oil work, which was technically true. Melody Price was unfinished business that required personal attention. Calvin waited in the shadows outside Jefferson's kitchen until closing time, then followed Melody home to her sister's apartment. She walked alone, apparently feeling safe in the familiar neighborhood. Calvin let her reach the building's entrance before emerging from the darkness. "Hello, Melody." She spun around, her face going white with terror. "Calvin, you can't be here. The custody agreement. The custody agreement gave me full parental rights in exchange for your permanent disappearance," Calvin said, stepping closer. "Contacting Matthew's school violates that agreement. I just wanted to know if he was okay." "You wanted to test my resolve," Calvin interrupted. "You wanted to see if I'd really follow through on my promises." Melody backed against the apartment building's door, fumbling for her keys. "Calvin, please. I know I made mistakes, but he's still my son." "No," Calvin said, his voice cutting through her pleas like a blade. You forfeited that relationship when you watched Rick break his leg and called it a soccer injury. Calvin reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila envelope. These are photographs from the night we had our conversation in the warehouse. They show your injuries, your confession, and the legal documents you signed. Copies are stored in multiple locations with instructions for distribution if anything happens to me. Melody's hands shook as she tried to insert her key into the lock. What do you want? I want you to understand that some agreements are permanent, Calvin said. I want you to understand that testing my boundaries will have consequences you won't survive. Calvin stepped closer, close enough that Melody could see the absolute certainty in his eyes. You have 24 hours to leave Portland. I don't care where you go, but it needs to be somewhere far from here and farther from Houston. If you ever contact anyone in Matthew's orbit again, his school, his friends, his neighbors, his doctors, our next conversation will be our last conversation. Melody finally got the door open and stumbled inside. Before she could close it, Calvin placed his hand against the frame. One more thing, Melody. I've been monitoring your communications for months. If you're thinking about going to the police or trying to get lawyers involved, remember that I have recordings of you confessing to enabling child abuse. The only reason you're not already in prison is because I choose to let you remain free. Calvin removed his hand from the doorframe. Make better choices, Melody. Your life depends on it. The door slammed shut, and Calvin heard multiple locks engaging. He walked away knowing that Melody would comply with his instructions. Some people needed to be told twice, but Melody wasn't one of them. She understood now that Calvin Charles was not a man who made idle threats. The flight back to Houston gave Calvin time to reflect on the past 3 months. He'd systematically dismantled every threat to his son's safety and well-being. Rick Haas had fled the state and would never return. The Pitts brothers had abandoned their criminal activities and left town permanently. Melody had been neutralized as a threat to Matthew's stability. More importantly, Calvin had proven to himself and his son that some principles were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. When Calvin arrived home, he found Matthew in the living room practicing guitar, a hobby he'd abandoned during the years with Rick but had recently rediscovered. "How was your business trip, Dad?" Matthew asked, not looking up from his instrument. "Successful," Calvin replied. "All the loose ends are tied up now." Matthew nodded and continued playing. He was old enough to understand that his father's business trips involved more than financial planning, and wise enough not to ask for details he didn't need to know. Calvin sat in his chair and listened to his son play, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced in years. Outside, the security system monitored the perimeter. Inside, his son was safe, healthy, and whole. Some prices were worth paying. Some lines were worth defending. Some wars were worth winning, regardless of the cost. Calvin Charles had won his war. Chapter 9. The Price of Victory. 1 year later, Calvin stood in the bleachers watching Matthew pitch in the regional championship game. His son had grown 4 inches and gained 30 pounds of muscle, transforming from Rick's victim into a confident young man who commanded respect from peers and adults alike. The transformation hadn't been easy. Matthew had struggled with anger, nightmares, and trust issues for months after leaving Portland. But Calvin had been patient, providing steady support while his son healed from the psychological wounds Rick and Melody had inflicted. Now Matthew was 17, a starting pitcher with a legitimate chance at a college scholarship, and more importantly, a young man who understood his own worth. Calvin's phone buzzed with a message from Angelo Murray. Annual security, review complete. No threats detected. Rick Haas confirmed deceased. Car accident in Nevada 6 months ago. Melody Price remains in Canada under assumed identity. Pitt's family permanently relocated to Florida, no criminal activity detected. Calvin deleted the message without surprise. He'd expected Rick's eventual death. Men like him tended to create enemies wherever they went, and without the Pitts family's protection, Rick had been vulnerable to retaliation from his many victims. Melody's survival was more surprising, but Calvin felt no remorse about driving her into permanent exile. She'd made her choice when she enabled Rick's abuse of Matthew. Living under an assumed identity in a foreign country was a more merciful fate than she deserved. Strike 3. The umpire called, and Calvin watched Matthew pump his fist as he struck out the final batter. The crowd erupted in celebration as Matthew's team advanced to the state championship. After the game, Calvin waited by the team bus while Matthew gathered his equipment. Several other parents approached to congratulate him on his son's performance, and Calvin accepted their praise with the quiet pride of a father who'd fought to earn the right to watch his child succeed. "Dad," Matthew said, appearing beside him with his gear bag. "Coach Williams wants to know if you can drive me to the recruitment meeting tomorrow. Says there's a scout from UT who's specifically interested in talking to me." "Of course," Calvin replied. "We'll leave early. Make sure you have plenty of time to make a good impression." As they drove home through the Houston suburbs, Calvin reflected on the choices that had brought them to this moment. He'd sacrificed his career, spent a fortune on security and legal fees, and crossed moral lines that most people would never consider crossing. But Matthew was safe, healthy, and thriving. The nightmares had stopped. The anger had been channeled into positive activities. The boy who'd once cowered before Rick Haas now faced the world with confidence and strength. "Some prices were worth paying." "Dad," Matthew said as they pulled into their driveway, "I know you've never told me exactly what happened to Rick and Mom, and I don't need to know the details. But I want you to know that I understand you did what you had to do to protect me." Calvin parked the car and turned to face his son. "What makes you say that?" "Because I know you," Matthew replied. "I know you would never let anyone hurt me if you had the power to stop it. And I know that sometimes stopping bad people requires doing things that good people don't usually do." Calvin felt a mix of pride and concern. His son had developed wisdom beyond his years, but that wisdom came from experiencing evil firsthand. "Do you think that makes me a bad person?" Matthew considered the question seriously. "I think it makes you my father. Rick used to tell me that you abandoned me because you didn't really love me. But everything you've done proves that you love me more than anything else in the world." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, father and son understanding each other in ways that didn't require words. "I'm proud of you, Matthew," Calvin said finally. "Not just for baseball, but for who you've become. You could have let what Rick did make you weak or bitter or afraid. Instead, you became stronger." "I learned from watching you," Matthew replied. "You taught me that some things are worth fighting for, no matter what it costs." Calvin smiled, a genuine expression of happiness that had been rare in the years after his divorce. "Just remember to choose your battles wisely. Not every fight is worth winning." "I will, Dad. But if someone ever threatens our family again..." Matthew left the sentence unfinished, but Calvin understood. His son had learned the same lesson that Calvin had been forced to learn. That evil exists in the world, that legal systems sometimes fail to protect the innocent, and that sometimes good people must do terrible things to protect what they love. It was a harsh lesson for a 17-year-old to learn, but it was also a necessary one. As they walked toward the house, Calvin felt the satisfaction of a mission completed. He'd set out to protect his son and punish those who'd hurt him. He'd succeeded on both counts. Rick Haas was dead, the Pitts family was scattered, and Melody Price was living in exile under an assumed name. More importantly, Matthew was safe, successful, and psychologically whole. Calvin had paid a price for this victory. He crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, made enemies who would never forgive, and accepted that he would never again be the man he'd been before Rick broke his son's leg. But some transformations were worth embracing. Some prices were worth paying. Some wars were worth winning, regardless of the moral cost. Calvin Charles had protected his family, defeated his enemies, and secured his son's future. In the end, that was all that mattered. The rest was just details.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.